Okay, everyone, thanks for joining us this morning. I look forward to today's panel. I want to welcome everyone to this panel of papers that's presented by the Identity Politics section of the New York State Political Science Association. The title of our panel this morning is Identity Politics in Troubling Times. And I think each of the papers in its own way addresses really important contemporary issues in American politics as they relate to identity. My name is Howell Williams. I use he, him pronouns. I am an associate professor of political science at Western Connecticut State University in Danbury, Connecticut. I'm also the Identity Politics section chair, and I will be chairing and acting as discussant for this morning's panel as well. So we have, as I said, 3 excellent and timely papers. I don't want to take too much time away from those presentations, so we're going to get started with David Monda's paper, The Lived Experiences of the Senegalese Entrepreneur Immigrants in Little Senegal, New York City during the period of COVID-19.
How much time do we have?
Oh, sorry, there will be 15 minutes per paper.
Okay, all right, great. All right, well, thank you, Howell, and everybody else. Thank you so much for, taking the time to be on this panel and for doing all the work to get our papers together. Howell, thanks so much for organizing this. My presentation today fits in within the context of our broader theme of these different identities and how identities are constructed, and the broader issue of identity politics. And I was very interested to find out how the lived experiences of Senegalese immigrant population, Senegalese immigrant entrepreneurs, what were their experiences during the COVID-19 period. And my specific focus was on Little Senegal, which is an area here in Harlem in New York City, roughly between 125th and 116th, and then also between Lexington Avenue and Malcolm X Avenue is the general area of what we'd call Little Senegal. And I was particularly interested in this demographic because this is a new immigrant population. It's a recent immigrant population, so post the broader immigration reforms of the 1960s. We had a large population of this group of diaspora coming into the United States, particularly in the late 70s and 80s. So a little bit of background and history of this demographic that we'll be studying in context. Traditionally, the Senegalese have tended to migrate to Europe for obviously geographical and historical reasons. Senegal was a former French colony, so there's those colonial and historical connections to to the old colonial empire. But Senegal is very close to Southern Europe, right? So it's very easy. It's an easy gateway for Senegalese to get into Europe. But also, let's not forget that Senegal has also had a very close historical connection with France in particular. Senegalese troops, Black African troops, fought on the side of the French during the First World War, during the occupation of the Weimar Republic, and even into the Second World War, and even as far back as Vietnam, right? So these links are important, but in terms of the connection of the Senegalese population to the United States, you start to see a much larger immigration of this population as traditional immigration routes to Europe, particularly Belgium and France, continue to become more restricted, with the anti-immigrant xenophobia and hatred that was boiling up in Europe, particularly in the early to late 80s. A lot more of this Senegalese population started to emigrate to the United States. my framing of this study was under two broad themes, right? So my sort of philosophical framing from an international relations perspective was a constructivist understanding of these broader questions of identity and how these immigrant identities in terms of the deserving and undeserving was framed within the host community of the Senegalese population in the United States. My two broad themes were entrepreneur survival and entrepreneur networks. And the dual challenge I was looking to analyze was really this broader question of how do migration authorities, not only within the state level and city level within New York City, but also more broadly at the federal level, how do they interact with this new African demographic of immigrants that come to the US? But I was also interested in how groups that cater, the non-government organizations, the IGOs, the civil society organizations that work with immigrants, right? How are the legal and social and political structures, how do they shape the different choices and narratives and framings of immigrant experiences in terms of how these NGOs and civil society organizations can cater to these immigrant populations. And again, my specific demographic was on Senegalese entrepreneur immigrants. So again, a broader framing of ideational and normative constructions of deserving and undeserving, how those are then seen within the framework of city, state, and federal law on immigration, but also more broadly, how these groups, this particular demographic finds itself within the immigrant host community. And more broadly, thinking historically about the African diaspora community, Africans have been framed, sort of the African definition and framing of African immigration. Africans have generally tended to be framed as a victim diaspora, either immigrating to the US because of refugee problems or humanitarian issues, or sort of a more broader deterioration of economic conditions from source countries. So when these Senegalese immigrant populations then emigrate to the United States, they really engage in very interesting modes of adaptation. And one of the big ones, which is not unique to this population, but is a variant and an adaptation of an adaptive strategy, is self-isolation. So self-isolation within cultural spaces of Senegalese immigrant communities. So if you came to Little Senegal here in Harlem, you'll see this whole range of spaces that have been taken up by this immigrant community within the framework of their businesses and their shops, in Little Harlem. And then piggybacking off of that element of adaptation is the broader issue and construction and understanding of selective assimilation. So this demographic will assimilate within a context of language. They're French speakers, but a lot of times they'll learn English, at least by the second generation. But they'll also acculturate within the context of businesses. They'll do trade and they'll do businesses. But it's selective also within the other context that they'll also maintain a lot of their traditional and cultural precepts. The Islamic religion, obviously within a much broader context of a Judeo-Christian, an American polity. And also a lot of their cultural precepts in terms of social networks, right? So they'll maintain a lot of the traditional Islamic structures and very rigid patriarchal structures constructed around Islam and around how the political economy of their businesses, are made up. So you'll find, children going to school, coming back in the afternoon and helping out in the stores. You'll find, the housewives also sharing in the burden of running the store, but it's a very patriarchal and a very structured, framing in terms of, maintaining of that cultural structure. How do these communities, what's their perception within the COVID context of their experiences? And herein is a very interesting dynamic, because a lot of these African immigrants generally, from my research in the field, tended to be very skeptical initially about, the whole COVID pandemic. As you'd all understand, New York was, particularly initially, was one of the worst hit, parts of the country. Huge numbers of people, people were dying in Brooklyn, in Little Harlem, and and all over the city. But there was a skepticism, from my interviews with this group about exactly what COVID was, and also tied in with sort of Trump's misinformation or lack of information on this particular issue. And then the other dynamic is with this population, when we think about Senegalese migrant immigrants, we need to think about them in the context of them not only being a trade diaspora, but a cultural diaspora. And these two things dovetail together, because there are trade diaspora in the context that they establish what I call Murid brotherhoods. So these are networks, Muslim networks of Senegalese communities, not only in the United States, but in Hong Kong, in Beijing, in Paris, in London, areas where you have significant Senegalese populations. And they develop these really interesting networks, not only with Senegalese populations in a lot of those diaspora communities in Europe, in Asia, and also in other parts of Africa. But these networks are interesting because they offer not only entrepreneurial networks and areas of socialization and integration within the Senegalese community abroad for newcomers, but they also provide social capital, and they provide collateral capital for new immigrants who may want to start businesses. Lastly, thinking about the experiences in terms of host communities, and therein lies this contradiction where this Senegalese immigrant population are considered, the model immigrants within the context of Muslim immigrants to the United States. So they benefit from the best of two contrasting yet contradicted and conflicting identities within which how the broader American society views this Muslim population. So on one hand, they're viewed as less rebellious than the African American Muslim nation of Islam. And then on the other hand, then they're also seen as less radical than, say, Middle Eastern Muslims and or Central Asian Muslims. So it's an interesting narrative around that demographic. Lastly, within the framework of COVID, I think there's a lot of stereotypes, that came through in my interviewing around how these groups were perceived. So Thomas, in his book, Global Epidemics, Local Realities, really highlights a lot of these juxtapositions, how the continent of Africa is perceived, how images of disease, crisis are played up in Western media, and how this influences how this diaspora community was seen. So when we think, for example, of Ebola, we think of SARS and those epidemics and the negative experiences towards Africans in terms of their migration. Also thinking about the broader context of the global South, Africa and the global South, and how disease is politicized and weaponized within the identity politics of Trumpism. So for example, how we have the China virus as sort of a broad narrative of the developing world, Africa included, but this really reinforces some of the negative stereotypes. So in conclusion, one of the areas I was interested in studying a little further was also immigrant experiences in COVID and some of these entrepreneurial networks for other Senegalese diaspora communities in places like Fouta Town in Brooklyn, right, where you have the other significant pocket of the Senegalese immigrants, but also comparing these immigrant experiences and their immigration situations under COVID with other growing groups of African immigrants. And in particular here, I'm thinking about the Gambians, and the Cameroonians and Guinea populations, and how these immigrant experiences are similar, but also how they're different. So in conclusion, very broadly, this narrative really exemplified the challenge of newer immigrants within a narrative of popular nationalism, right? And xenophobic attitudes towards immigrants. But thinking about a broader narrative of how local, city, and state and federal authorities can create environments where these business entrepreneurs can grow their businesses, increase local taxes during very difficult economic times, but also create spaces, not only business, but living spaces that are not hostile to these new immigrant groups and entrepreneurs. Thank you.
That was great. Your timing was fantastic, David. Thank you so much. I look forward. I have a few things to say about your paper. I think it's a really interesting project. Our next paper comes from Sarah. Sorry, I'm just finding your title. Sarah Elizabeth Jones from Syracuse University has a paper for us that's called "What Makes Pandemics Matter: Racial and Religious Identities as Determinants of COVID-19 Response."
Great. So I'm just going to share my slides real quick, if you don't mind waiting. So I really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all and hear your feedback on my work. I'm looking forward to your comments. And with that, this is my presentation. So I'm quoting here Kenneth Copeland. You don't need to read it, but if you haven't heard of him, he's a pretty well-known, relatively evangelical televangelist. And so this quote I felt like kind of encapsulated sort of my impetus for this project. He was speaking March 11th of 2020, so prior to shutdowns. He, prior to this quote, compared COVID to the common flu, and then went on to talk about how fear of illness would allow the devil in, and how that's sinful. And so I think it's exemplary of the fact that COVID-19 pandemic presented a crisis with which religious people and leaders had to determine their responses. And so responses ranged from Kenneth Copeland, who told listeners that COVID was just the flu and that fear was from the devil, to leaders who also used the rhetoric of loving your neighbor to argue that compliance with COVID guidelines was a religious duty. And so we see religious leaders kind of spanning the gamut in terms of responses. But this is happening at a time when partisanship is increasing in the United States. And we know, thanks to work from Guderian, Goodman, and Popinski, that COVID response is highly partisan. So throughout the pandemic, Republicans are found to be less compliant, less cautious, less likely to be supportive of mandates to mitigate COVID, and less concerned about the pandemic overall. So that meant that the COVID-19 pandemic was a really good opportunity for me to ask my research question, which was, is there an interactive relationship between religious and racial identities in the formation of partisan viewpoints? So I'm choosing to include race in this question because data shows that the proportion of evangelicals who are non-white is rising in the United States. So we're seeing specifically more Asian American and Hispanic American people joining the evangelical church. And additionally, research indicates that within Catholic and mainline Protestant groups, there are some differences in the ways in which non-white adherents behave as opposed to white adherents. So I felt like COVID was a rich opportunity to study this question because the pandemic response closely aligns with partisanship, but it is not exactly partisanship, which means that COVID response can be used as a dependent variable without the same degree of concern about endogeneity that using partisanship on its own would have. And so I am using a lot from Liliana Mason's work on social partisanship. So she argues that partisanship is increasingly related to one's social identities in the United States. So to the degree where one's voting behavior can be indicative of racial and ethnic groups, gender, religious affiliation, etc. But she also writes that there's people who face what she calls cross pressures. So these are people whose identities are contradictory to their partisanship. And so they can be wholly contradictory, or their identities might be slightly misaligned. So I think of the example of a Black evangelical Christian who the literature suggests that evangelical Christians generally support the Republican Party, whereas the literature also suggests that Black Americans generally support the Democratic Party at high rates. So their social identities aren't entirely aligned with kind of the social partisanship spectrum that Mason points to. These people are really interesting because they are the most likely to act as swing voters and also the most likely to interact with people across the political spectrum. So in an era that is increasingly socially polarized, this is a really interesting segment of society. And this is part of why I wanted to do this work. So for my dependent variable, I'm using a COVID response index, using 3 questions. It's asking about whether or not people perceive the coronavirus to be a threat to the health of the United States population, whether or not people believe that houses of worship should be required to follow the same social distancing rules as other local areas, and if a public health official told you that you should quarantine yourself, would you? And so this is getting at whether or not people believe that houses of worship are on par with other local venues, whether or not people view the pandemic as a concern, and also whether or not they're going to be compliant with mandates. So when these are coded properly, there's a Cronbach's alpha of 0.626 for this measure. So it's adequate as an index, though not perfect, but we'll take it. So I am using a survey administered by Pew from July 13th through the 19th of 2020. I'm really excited about the time period for this because July of 2020 we were seeing COVID mandates kind of eased in some areas and not in others. But also this was the time at which people's COVID response was becoming more variable. So, in March and April, collectively, on the whole, people were much more amiable towards lockdowns and not going out. Whereas in July, we were starting to see some variability. So unfortunately, I have to focus only on form 1 of the survey because one of my questions only got asked on that one. So I'm limited to 5,071 respondents. And though I initially set out to break down every religious group and every racial and ethnic group, this would require oversampling of racial and ethnic minorities as well as religious minorities, which unfortunately this survey did not do. So I have combined some groups into an other Christians category, which covers Mormon, Orthodox, and a few others, pretty smaller groups, and then also other faiths. So those are relatively small groups. And then I think actually your pictures might be over the numbers, but there are also only 150 Asian American respondents and only about 400 Black respondents. So this is certainly a limiting factor in the analysis, which is why I ultimately used first a binary white and non-white interaction term in an OLS regression to model my relationships with the control variables, and then also then later built the models out so that we could kind of see more of the patterns. So my hypotheses for the smaller variables were that white evangelicals would have significantly lower COVID response scores than other groups. White mainline Protestants would have significantly higher COVID response scores than other groups. White Catholics will have significantly higher COVID response scores than other groups. And white other Christians would have significantly lower COVID response scores than other groups. And white respondents of other faiths would have significantly higher COVID response scores than other groups. So I'm happy to talk more about why I came to these conclusions. I kind of describe a little bit more in the paper, but there is some work that suggests that when Christian nationalism is controlled for, religiosity is actually correlated with higher COVID response. So that is kind of where some of this came from. What you're seeing now is, I just got a little pop-up. Can you all see my slides? Okay, all right, that's good. So what you're looking at now is the regression of the binary white and non-white variable as an interaction term. And so what we find is that for most of the models, there is a significant interaction between race and religious affiliation. So specifically for white evangelicals, they have significantly lower responses in almost every model, as well as Catholics. So I was expecting Catholics to be behave differently than white evangelicals, but this suggests that potentially these theological differences, at least on this issue, might be subsumed by political similarities between these groups. Additionally, both of these groups suggest that partisanship really is a big part of the story. When you include a variable about whether or not they're Republican, you see that there is no interaction. And so I suggest that perhaps the confluence of whiteness and these religious identities leads to the response that we're seeing here. So they're aligned, essentially, they're socially polarized correctly. And what we see as well is that other Christians also have a significantly lower responses in almost every model. And white people of other faiths actually have significantly higher responses. So that was in line with what I had hypothesized. And then also surprisingly for me, white Protestants did not have any significant relationship in the interaction terms. So this suggests that there is a great deal of variation within this group. And I look forward to engaging this further in future research. So in my next two models, what I did is I subsetted by religious group and also subsetted by racial group, and then compared within religious group variation according to race and ethnicity, and also within race and ethnicity variation by religion. And so what we see is that within Christian groups, Black, Asian, and Hispanic respondents have significant or close to significantly higher COVID response scores than white people of the same religious group. So this is about what we were expecting based on the interaction terms in the binary model. But this allows for clearer patterns. What we can see is specifically for Black respondents, there are higher COVID response scores amongst evangelicals, Catholics, and other Christians. So this is consistent with a lot of the other literature, which suggests that for Black Americans, race is of really particularly high salience. And so it is difficult for other identities to kind of shift partisanship in that way. Additionally, we see that in most of these models, white respondents behave significantly differently. They have lower COVID response scores across all groups, again, except for the Protestant churches where there's not really a clear pattern. And when we look specifically at evangelicals, we find that Asian American and Hispanic evangelicals do have significantly lower response scores than people with the same race and ethnicity, but a different religious tradition. So this finding was particularly interesting for me because it goes along with the theory that I was suggesting that Asian American and Hispanic American evangelicals who are joining the evangelical church might be having their partisan viewpoints shifted by these religious communities, or And I look forward to, in future research, delving more into the mechanisms by which that's occurring. But at this point, and showing that these relationships do exist. So conclusions that I reached was that Catholics and evangelicals are really similar, which I was not expecting because of the deep theological differences between these groups, but to see their partisanship being so aligned, I think is really interesting, and I think suggests a movement towards these groups aligning. Additionally, there is clear evidence of an overall interactive relationship, though it does not apply equally to all groups. So we know that, consistent with some other work, there's a great deal of evidence for this operating specifically for evangelical Christians and perhaps not for other groups to the same degree. And additionally, Black respondents, as I mentioned earlier, appear to prioritize their racial identity over other social identities when determining partisanship. So I look forward to, in the future, expanding this study. I would like to continue this, but with an oversampled data set to allow for greater understanding of these relationships. But I'm excited about the preliminary evidence that these trends exist. And I'm also very excited for additional work on mainline Protestants to understand kind of what patterns might exist if there isn't any in this data. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I really look forward to hearing your all's feedback.
Great. Another fantastic paper that is very well timed. So again, I've lots of really interesting things. The paper raises some really interesting questions about contemporary politics that hopefully we'll get to discuss in just a bit. Our final paper is from Brian Ford. The title is Antagonistic Democracy and Racism Denial, Critical Race Theory and Its Discontents. Brian, you're muted.
I'm going to share my slides in a second, but I just want to say that, I'm a non-COVID paper, but I still am a topical paper, and it's related because I think when you look at these, you'll see the same polarization on the CRT, anti-CRT issue as you would on COVID response. Same groups who are likely to be anti-COVID mitigation efforts are also likely to be anti-CRT. And that's not an accident. There's a lot of things going behind the scenes. So let me see if I can get my screen up. And see how successful I am at this. And share screen. Where am I here? All right. Messages, sorry about that. It's not giving me Adobe, so I'm going to have to do this one instead. Okay. And you're seeing a bunch of different things, I take it?
We've got open Office Writer.
Right. Yeah, if you're seeing my screen and you're seeing a bunch of open things, I just need to, I was going to do it from Adobe, and I closed the presentation. So I've got a little circle going around. Let's see. Okay.
I think you distributed to them.
I did. It should be coming up now.
Okay. I can open them if you're.
Yeah. I did, and it's on my screen, and I'm waiting for it to show up. Okay. Now can you see it?
No, we just have your notes.
As my screen sharing is paused. So
I think we've got it now. Yep, that looks good.
okay. All right. So we got in the title, Democracy and Racism Denial. And I was a teacher in the New York City Board of Ed for a long time after doing my graduate work at Columbia on comparative politics. And I've been writing somewhat, now I'm just trying to, sorry, I'm not used to doing this. Just trying to advance the slide. And I'm not getting this advance. Sorry about this. All right. There. I'm sorry, the title of the program was Critical Race Theory and its Discontents, Racism Denial, and Putting Parents First. I'm sorry, I'm just having problems getting
Brian,
there.
would it be helpful if I put it on if I shared my screen? I have the slides that you sent us on PowerPoint.
All right, try that. See, are they open for you? Because they did not, yeah, you could do that. That'd be good. I want this to be easy. So should I stop my share?
Yeah, that's fine. If you'll just stop sharing, I'm just opening them now.
Yeah.
Thanks for your patience, everyone. This is always the tech stuff is always a challenge.
I don't know why it wouldn't share the Adobe, but it didn't.
There are always surprises on Zoom. That's right. We've been doing this for 2 years and it feels like we're still navigating challenges. Okay, I have the slides. I'm just going to share them now.
Just a second. Now I have another problem.
Okay, all good?
Yeah, I guess so. I've got a problem with my screen here, but I think I can deal with that. All right, so we have this slide is up on title on the program. I'm sort of running blind here now. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I think we have the slides up, right? Can people see? Yeah. So.
Yeah, but I'm just. All right. So we're on which slide are we on? Because I cannot see them.
Title in the program.
All right. Title in the program. Yeah. So go to the next one, please.
Right. Not just an article.
Not just an article, but it's on its way to being a book. It's meant to be the concluding chapter of a book called Democratic Education Markets, etc. And the book uses Amy Gutman's Democratic Education as a heuristic device to examine market emulation models in education, date back to at least the 1980s. And this begins, the segue is between this use of Amy Gutman and to CRT. Gutman lists 3 sources of authority in education: parents, the state, and educational professionals. In my book, I go to a 4th source, the business community. So we should go to Amy Gutman in a thumbnail.
Yep.
Yeah, Gutman's work was mainly meant to be prescriptive rather than descriptive. It's an attempt to explain what is necessary in the education system to preserve democracy. And there are 3 main points. None of the 3 sources of authority is itself sufficient to provide democratic education. She says things, for instance, like we need professional educators to guard against the whims of parents. That's pretty much a direct quote. Education professionals must establish and monitor principles of non-repression and non-exclusion, which are 2 of our main principles. And students should be trained in deliberative democracy so as to be effective future citizens. Now, in looking at business models, so we're now turning Amy Gutman on her head.
Yep.
My argument in the book is that the influence of the business community is central While they're not a direct authority, the neoliberal precepts of education reform influence policy primarily by doing the following: discrediting public enterprises, including public ed, encouraging privatization and outsourcing, advocating for charters as for vouchers rather, and as a second choice charters, and changing the mission of the schools so that it's no longer the emphasis on democratic citizens and deliberative democracy, but economic citizens and somehow finding your niche in the economic system. Next, how can you further examine this this treatment? I was a little punchy at the time. This treatment of neoliberal education reform. First, I have an almost decade-old book, which is called Respect for Teachers, with more content in the subtitle, The Rhetoric Gap and How Research on Schools is Laying the Ground for New Business Models in Education. And I have a bunch of more recent articles that they actually form the content of this next book. So, but we get to the concluding chapter. Are we on that slide?
We're looking at the cover of your book.
Oh, good. What do you think?
The articles, now I'm on concluding chapter. Yeah, we're good.
Yeah. All right. I really like the little clock man. Antagonistic democracy and racism denial. The advent of CRT seems to be something different than the business influence I described in the book and the articles, which are the same, by the way. But the business influence pointed to a change in purpose from democratic education to what I'm using here as a niche finding education defined in economic terms. Let's go to neoliberal education summary. As a New York City DOT teacher for 25 years, I benefited from participant observation. In the 1980s, we see an emphasis on rigor and academic standards. In the 1990s, an emphasis on standardized testing, which is made possible by computer technology, by the way. In the 2000s, we see an emphasis on using tests to rate students, districts, and educators. In the 2010s, new evaluation systems are unveiled in a multi-pronged effort from, among others, Arne Duncan, the head of the US Department of Education, Bill Gates, Mike Bloomberg, Michelle Rhee, and my favorite hedge fund manager, Whitney Tilson. So you end up with, there's a connection, however, between neoliberal education and CRT, which is, I hope we're on that slide now, because beginning in 2020, we see a new argument, the anti-CRT movement, and this seems something quite different, but it shares something with neoliberal ed. What they share is an emphasis on parental authority, either expressed as parental choice in the neoliberal model or as parental authority. And the flip side of this is an attack on teacher and educator autonomy. The slide should be slides 13, parents over teachers.
Yep.
In both cases, it means a recalibration of the balance of authority in education. Business influence attempts were indirect. First, they were through parents for advocating for school choice for parents. Then through the state, advocating for changing mission of the schools, advocating for change management of the schools, advocating for change labor relations in schools. And they were against teachers and educators, and they were definitely against unions. They were against teachers. This is slide 14.
Yep.
One difference was mayoral control, at least in New York. It was instituted in 2002 under new mayor Mike Bloomberg. And some effects, there was a new generation of administrators and principals who were brought in mass. This is a little anecdote, which I probably shouldn't share, but when I was hired in 2002, the principal who hired me, I never worked under because she retired. She retired because she got a buyout offer. And the buyout offer was based on her high principal rankings. So in 2002, when they are instituting a new system, which changed the old BOE to the new DOE, the first thing they did is got rid of their highly ranking principals by giving them buyout offers. And so that's one change. There are new guiding principles based on market emulation and business efficiency. There's an increase in hierarchy. There's a type of creative disruption. They actually hired Jack Welch, not hired him, but got Jack Welch to speak to the new principals. Jack Welch of GE. And they started to break up large schools and establish smaller schools and establish charter schools. And in 2010s, there are new evaluation systems, and there's an effort to make teachers at-will employees. And of course, there's an effort to discredit unions as distributional coalitions. What's my time like?
You've got 9 minutes.
Okay, so number 16, against teachers. Much of this also came from the Cheney-Bush administration. No Child Left Behind called for annual testing of grades 3 to 8. And that was limited to English language skills. You got rid of literature. And there was a big push for nonfiction reading and math. So you got, reading, writing, arithmetic. And it's a business-driven curriculum in what business people need, the skills they need to fill their slots. Literature and social studies are de-emphasized, even science is put off. Nonfiction reading is called for. Test scores are used to identify failures. Number 16, the poor test results, which correlate highly with areas of concentrated poverty, were used to close down schools, fire principals, rake teachers. This continues in the Obama administration under Arne Duncan. Classic example is Central Falls High School in Rhode Island, where they fired the entire staff. And new evaluation systems using Heidi ratings that were developed beginning in the late 2000s, instituted in early 2010s. There's even a discourse on teacher deselection, which comes from the Hoover Institution. Eric, I can't remember his name. I can't remember his name right now. Very nice guy, but he just said you should fire the lowest 10% of teachers. Actually, he said the lowest 5% until he got into the Wall Street Journal, and then he made it 10%. But that echoing Jack Welch. Now let's talk about CRT. CRT, the anti-CRT movement, we're on number 17, calls for parental veto power over what to teach. It's a huge increase in parental authority. It's a decrease in elimination of teacher autonomy. It makes demands on schools and teachers to potentially make education and teaching unworkable, which may be the point. Because if you want to discredit public education and undermine democracy by hamstringing democratic education, well, you can withhold resources, you can make demands on the schools, and all of a sudden they don't function as well. But the anti-CRT movement, this is number 18, has multiple contexts. There's an historical materials context about class divisions and theories of hegemony, which I go over in a section. There's this new pattern of antagonistic democracy, which, as compared to deliberative democracy or even agonistic democracy, which is a term that comes from Chantal Mouffe, that there's the partisan and brinkmanship and quasi-fascist strategies of intimidation tend to break down collective decision-making. Then there's racism denial as a political strategy. I don't do not as nice work with the Pew Research stuff as Sarah did, but there are a lot of surveys that say the majority of whites believe that whites are discriminated against more than blacks, up to 2/3. I list some of the sources in the paper. Another context is the color line, as in Du Bois and Jim Crow, the development of Jim Crow, as C. Van Woodward indicates. Both of them link back to the historical materialist analysis by saying, if the elites are going to lead the workers, then you got to divide the workers. So why not divide them across the color line? In the 1870s, there were class solidarity populist movements in the South, including in Georgia. But by the 2000s, by the 1900s, they've disappeared and Jim Crow has been instituted. Partisan electoral competition is a wedge issue, increased racial antagonism. It's anti-BLM, it's anti a lot of things. And there's this question of generic CRT versus CRT proper, which I'm probably not going to get to. And there are more contexts. There are a lot of discourses associated with the CRT, which is actually, that is a generic CRT I'm talking about. What the right, and this particular man named Chris Rufo did, was just dump them all in one pile. So CRT is no longer Derek Bell's academic theory that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado and others. Instead, it becomes anything that's critical about race and has a theoretical framework. So it include Ibrahim Kendi's anti-racism, the 1619 Project, the discourses on white privilege, on the Black body, on white gaze, white fragility. I put some of these together in what I call CRTA, critical race therapeutic articulation. But basically we're looking at 3 R's again: racial trauma, reparations, and what we call the reckoning. I probably won't get to that either. So the anti-CRT strategy, and we're now on 20.
Yep.
it uses a wedge issue, and clear examples in the Virginia election, clear examples with Governors Abbott and DeSantis. Second, they misrepresent CRT. They associate it with socialism in the Frankfurt School. That's especially Steve Bannon, who's picking up on Andrew Breitbart's theories. They depict it as un-American and a rejection of progress. That's Pluck, Rose, and Lindsay. You hear people on CNN saying, they're messing with our kids and they're going to regret it, things like that. So they group CRT with these associated discourses. And lately, they've also been connecting it with anti-LGBTQ legislation. So on 21, and this is most important, is this element of racism denial, the desire to rewrite history, developing a new senso comune, taking a phrase from Gramsci. And as my in-laws in the Ohio Valley say, what white privilege? We don't have white privilege. We can't even make our mortgage payments. 6, they use quasi-fascist tactics of intimidation. These are borrowed from challenges to the 2020 election, and further back in 2000, the Roger Stone instigated Brooke Brothers riot that actually kept Dade County, I believe, from doing their recount. Their protests at school boards, threatened school board members, target teachers as groomers. And they put this all together as attacking some sort of woke tyranny, described as part of an overarching leftist conspiracy. I'm on 20. So there are common understandings. I'm not out. How much time do I have now?
You got about 2 minutes.
All right. So I want to get to the, I'm going to move ahead then, if I got 2 minutes. I'm going to move ahead to, number 35, W.E. Du Bois and C. Vann Woodward.
For the first slide with that, Timothy Lewis convincingly argued.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Okay.
I used Du Bois and Woodward because of this matter of dividing the working class against itself, pitting whites against blacks. The argument that you find in Bannon and other people that CRT is somehow socialism and it's derived from the Frankfurt School and critical theory, just putting race in the middle, is ludicrous in a lot of ways, because what CRT tries to do is avoid class reductionism. And Timothy Lewis, who's out in Southern Illinois and was on a panel at NYSPSA at Northeastern with me back in November, says, that really what you have to do is trace it back to the Du Boisian color line. And again, this question of somehow dividing the working class against itself so that it makes it possible to create a cross-class coalition based on racial solidarity rather than a cross-racial movement based on class solidarity. There's a lot more here, but just only one thing. If you go to number 37.
History of anti-CRT.
Yeah. And I'll just finish up with this. Christopher Rufo, who's a journalist out in Seattle, saw an anti-bias meeting, an anti-bias training, and he got the slides for it. And he used that to group all these different discourses together in some sort of generic CRT and to attack it. And what he said is his strategy was clearly, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation, are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic, as we will put all the various cultural insanities under that brand category. And so he basically invented generic CRT. We're in 38. And he came up with a bunch of things from the anti-bias training in Seattle, some examples, ways of seeing that are hidden from us in white supremacy and such. So if you might want to look at number 39, and I'll just stop there. 39 has the has a slide from a similar anti-bias training in the Bronx. And you can see that he was able to use this and leverage this as an example. And so that he starts to discredit all these other elements that are in this generic CRT category, such as the 1619 project, for which there are a lot of genuine, legitimate criticisms, as well as a lot of others. So I go through these in the rest of the paper, but I think my time is up.
Thanks very much, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Brian, and thanks all of the presenters. Some really interesting papers that I do think cohere together in neat ways. So I'd like to just say a little bit about each paper. So I'll start with David's paper. This is a fascinating snapshot at how immigrants in Harlem responded to COVID. I think this work is important for understanding the nation's collective response to the pandemic, because it zeroes in and illuminates the experiences of folks who live at the margins of political life. And I was reminded, as I read, of the Black feminist insistence on focusing on those at the margins of society and tailoring a political response to their needs. This paper demonstrates how the pandemic was experienced by people navigating multiple challenging systems at once: immigration, municipal government, challenging, public health concerns, et cetera. David uses two sort of conceptual devices: entrepreneur survival and entrepreneur networks. I think this is an interesting theoretical framework. I'd like to know a little bit more about their development and operation, though. It might even be helpful in the paper to have a kind of schematic demonstrating how these networks nurtured the research subjects during the pandemic. What types, how I would like to see the networks sort of sketched out. Clearly, they were in operation before the pandemic, but a little bit more about how they responded to the challenge of the pandemic would be helpful. You talk about the structural and environmental frameworks of Senegalese immigrants, including anti-Blackness and anti-Muslim sentiments. I think this is useful. I'd like a little bit more about how these structural and environmental frameworks operate in the day-to-day lives of these Senegalese immigrants that you explore. The paper pushes us to think about political actors at the nexus of anti-Blackness and anti-immigrant politics. Critiques of the Trump administration's immigration policies or the racist operation of government are combined in the lived experiences of Senegalese New Yorkers. And so I think that's a really interesting kind of contribution. The biggest thing that I have about the paper is I want more from these interviews. I want to know these people. Provide some quotes from the interview subjects would give us even more depth in understanding how these New Yorkers faced this harrowing time and confronted a global pandemic while navigating a racist immigration system. So for example, some places where I would like a little bit more of that texture, you talk about the suspicions of government messaging about the seriousness of COVID. I'm curious, was this consistent across immigrant groups? Was there variation in that suspicion about government response? You talk about vaccine skepticism and social media. This is a quote on page 8. You say the contradictory pseudoscience around the coronavirus proliferated on social media and was reinforced by a campaign of disinformation that strained the Senegalese immigrant community's trust in state governments. I'd like to know about social media habits. I'd like to know how your research subjects use social media and how vaccine skepticism and other kind of misinformation around the pandemic, the specific ways that these people encountered that sort of information challenge. The paper goes into fascinating detail about the relationship between Senegalese and African-American Harlem denizens. I'm just curious, does this make broader coalitional politics more challenging at the local level, this tension between African-American and Senegalese Americans in Harlem? You talk about the entrepreneur network, and you mentioned this in the presentation as well, of a sort of dual diaspora of trade and culture. You seem to hint that these two facets are co-constitutive, that trade is culture, or there is sort of culture in trade. I'd just be curious to know more about this and whether these two aspects of the diaspora experience are co-constitutive. And in the spirit of the kind of multiple identities that you explore in the piece, there's relatively little on gender in this paper. How was the Senegalese response to COVID experienced through gender? In what ways were men and women situated vis-a-vis the frameworks you describe? And then finally, the conclusion points to two important areas for future study. First, other African immigrant populations' responses to COVID. And second, the role of activists, attorneys, and non-state actors in navigating COVID in these communities. I think both are really fruitful. What type of variation do you think you would find in different African immigrant populations? And finally, are attorneys and activists seen as trustworthy in terms of public health messaging? Or are they only reliable for navigating the immigration system? In other words, like, is there a resource in the attorneys and activists that are already working on behalf or in collaboration with these interview subjects? Were they effective at kind of communicating public health as well? Or they're sort of, that strikes me as an interesting question to pursue if you develop this further. Turning to Sarah Elizabeth's paper, the paper contributes to the sort of ample literature that we have on partisanship and identity in contemporary American politics by asking whether an interactive relationship exists between racial and religious identities as determinants of partisan aligned beliefs. That's your quote. I didn't write that. You wrote that. So Jones thus expands our thinking about identity politics to include religious observance as an identity shaping political behavior. Really important, I think. A few thoughts on your paper. You talk about religious leaders' role here. This is on page 4. You have like a paragraph where you talk about the role. I think this is in your literature review where you talk about the role of religious leaders. I'm curious, like, where does this phenomenon that you identify, where does it come from? Are evangelical leaders taking cues from religious leaders, or is sort of politics infiltrating political life and then kind of bubbling up to the level of leadership? I'm curious. I don't know, and I'd be interested to hear. And I don't know if your data will reveal that, but if you have any insights on that, I'd like to hear them. As a practical matter, I am curious about the inclusion of the discussion of religious leaders here. Is this part of your larger dissertation project? Like, it seems like kind of it kind of sticks out in the literature review. So I'm just curious, like, what the role of elites in shaping these responses is, and if that's a direction that you intend to pursue in the future. Following from David's paper, I'm also curious about how the views analyzed in your paper map onto views about government more generally. Government distrust is an enduring feature of American political culture, but it isn't experienced in the same ways across the polity. I'm thinking here of Alexandra Felindra's work. She's a political scientist at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and she does work on like race and distrust in government. And I think that could be really instructive for you. There are reasons, so like reasons for distrust in government shade from legitimate to paranoid. But there are some reasons why some groups might be distrustful of government response. For example, Senegalese immigrants in Harlem, right? Like their distrust in government is well placed. So this paper or the dissertation might add to this literature on identity and government distrust by considering how it interacts with race and religion as well. For me, an interesting finding in the paper, this is again a quote from you on page 2, evangelical Christianity and religion interact in the formation of partisan beliefs for whites, but not for other religious traditions. You also find that white respondents of other religious traditions have significantly higher COVID response scores, and white respondents of other Christian traditions have significantly lower COVID response scores. I wonder if education might be an interacting variable here. You don't really talk about education, but that, if I'm thinking about those two populations and kind of what could drive some of the explanation, it seems like education might be a factor. Your findings also confirm an enduring trend in recent American political development, and that's the political alignment of white Catholics and evangelicals. You said that this was a surprising find in your paper. I was not surprised by this in your paper. I mean, I know you know this history too, but so like the analysis demonstrates the success, I think, of a political project stemming back from the mid-20th century to fuse the interests of these two groups in the electoral coalition of the modern GOP. And so I guess I wasn't as I wasn't surprised by the finding, but I do think that your finding is a powerful indicator of how successful this political project has been. So in a larger project, potentially in your dissertation, it would be helpful to connect your finding to the history of the production of this political coalition. In the background of all of this is a pandemic that has had racially unequal impacts on American society. Your paper reminded me of a recent study published by a team of psychologists that found a quote, this is a quote from the article, that white people surveyed in the United States in the fall of 2020 cared less about COVID protocols and were even more likely to shun pandemic safety precautions after learning about the disproportionate ways that the virus impacts Black and other communities of color. That's a close quote. These strike me as deeply unchristian ways of responding to a public health crisis. So I guess I'm curious about how religious dogma is operating in these responses. Like, for example, you talk about prosperity gospel versus like a community focus. So I think a deeper dive into kind of like the dogmatic differences at work here might be useful. Like what are the messages that these Christians, and I'll put that in quotes, are getting when we see in other manifestations that they genuinely care less about the virus when they find out that it's people of color that are bearing the brunt of the virus. And finally, I'm just curious about the impact. This is a big challenge. I don't think that you have to answer this necessarily, but I'm just thinking about what the impact on democracy itself is for this finding. Like, part of the problem with COVID strikes me as just a general withdrawal from common cause or from a total rejection of the social contract. And so those who view salvation as their purpose on earth have less interest in upholding their responsibility to the good of all. How does this withdrawal from the political sphere shape identity and create new challenges for our collective democratic project? Again, that's a big question, but your paper really was driving home that that's a problem. And finally, Brian's paper, I mean, this is a sprawling and ambitious project, Brian, and I regret that I did not have the time to fully explore the paper that you sent in full depth. So I focused on the sections that you sort of drew my attention to. I also think it's a topical project that deserves to be read by a wide audience because it addresses issues that we are confronting in contemporary politics. What's at stake in this critical race theory debate. I think what you have needs a lot of development into a fully fledged book project, but I understand now from the presentation that I see how this fits into that project a little bit better. Your argument in what you submitted is that anti-critical race theory movement is a method, this is your quote, a method of changing what Gramsci called the senso comune, you talked about this in your presentation as well, as an effort to move authority from educational professionals to parents, as a wedge issue to be used in electoral competitions, et cetera, some of the things that you brought up in your presentation. You also write that it's a wedge issue meant to sustain cross-class racial coalitions, and all of this feels accurate to me. I mean, I don't have, it doesn't have the kind of depth of empirics as like a paper like Sarah's, but I do think that there is, I agree. I think that there's something there. And so in order to make the claims that you make, you lean on a Gramscian theory of hegemony and ideology. And I think I was surprised to see that here. I like the use of Gramsci. I think you handle his complex ideas well, but I'm not entirely sure how the term hegemony is being used here. Is the claim that anti-CRT is hegemonic or seeks to be hegemonic, or that race operates to conceal class antagonisms? I think from your presentation, I have a clearer sense of that. There's a rich literature on this second point about how race operates to conceal class antagonisms. And so you mentioned some in the, you used Du Bois. I was thinking of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, and that could be incorporated here as well, perhaps. Another issue for me with the Gramscian approach is that I think it reifies binary power relations, worker, capitalist, white, Black. And I think this can actually muddy the analytical framework a little bit. So here I was thinking about David's paper and how there are tensions among, the Black residents of Harlem, like, that the Senegalese immigrant experience sort of complicates facile kind of black-white delineation. So I don't have a problem with the Gramscian analysis, but I would like the units of analysis clarified a little bit. So I looked at section 1 and section 4. Section 1 is on antagonistic democracy. This section contributes to, I think, what has become kind of a cottage industry in recent political science, and that is what I call dying democracy lit. This section identifies education as an important barometer of democratic decline, incorporating people like Amy Gutman and John Dewey, all really good. You also rightly point out that this is what I liked about this section, that like democratic decline is a pervasive issue in American political thought. You would bring in Tocqueville, for example, to show that, concern about democratic decline is as old as the Republic itself. So this paper thus makes an important intervention in dying democracy lit by pointing out that this country has always had a precarious relationship with democracy as such. You write that 3 features of contemporary conservatism have coalesced around anti-CRT: the market-based anti-government element, the political win at all costs element, and the divine mission element. I think this is really clever and really useful, and I think you should develop these points more. Perhaps even, I suggested this before I knew the shape of the book project, but I would say even a chapter on these 3 sort of elements of contemporary conservatism and how they operate in opposition to CRT. I think that would be really interesting.
Could you just repeat back to me what the 3 were? I know it's in my paper, but.
Yeah, it's your quote. The market-based anti-government element, the political win at all costs element, and the divine mission element. I think that seems really clever. It kind of reminds me of Reagan's 3-legged stool of conservatism, although he, claimed 3 different elements. So I think you're making a really kind of novel observation there, and I'd just like to see you develop that more. And then finally, the section 4, which is on CRT and what you call CRTA, or critical race traumatic articulation. My problem here is that you seem to accept the anti-CRT argument that CRT does in fact find its way into the classroom, despite the fact that it isn't taught as an idea as such. For example, on page 39, you say that CRT is, quote, likely to permeate some teachers' approaches and appear in the classroom. I'm not so willing to accept the argument against critical race theory there. And you also distinguish between CRT proper and generic CRT, or later CRT and CRTA. This distinction feels for me a little speculative, and I'm not sure that this nomenclature does a good enough job of refuting the argument that these 2 things are not the same. So I just want to push back a little bit on the anti-CRT argument that, talking about white privilege is a form of critical race something. But we can disagree about that. You seem to be making an argument that these 2 phenomena are dialectical, sort of following from your kind of Marxist Gramscian analysis above. And in that sense, the CRTA designation does make sense. I would just like a little bit less of a theoretical justification via people like Antonio Gramsci or Richard Rorty, and more of a practical assessment about whether these 2 modes of inquiry are in fact co-constitutive. In other words, how does CRT produce the conditions for CRTA? To what uses can they be meaningfully deployed? So anyway, there's lots to consider with your paper. I think you have a sophisticated theoretical framework. I would just encourage you to bulk it out more with more empirical evidence. And I have these typed. I will send them to each of you individually as well. But we should open the floor to, we have a guest. So if our guest has any questions about the papers, or if any of the panelists would like to respond or talk to each other about their papers. We have about 15 minutes.
All right. How is it okay if I go? I don't know if
Please.
Remy, right. I know Remy, so I don't know if Remy, do you have Remy's our guest. I don't know if maybe I'll give her a chance.
No, I don't have any questions. Good.
Okay. All right. All right. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you so much, Howell, for your feedback. Very, very helpful. I still have a lot of work to do on this project. So thank you for for highlighting that. I think, and also help, for sort of tying in the broader framing of, Sarah's paper, and broader concepts of the CRT, right? Which I think articulated in the other presentation. So if I may, Howell, maybe a couple responses, and also highlight some of the areas which I'm still working on. I think one of the interesting framings, maybe let me start from the back and head forward in terms of your comments. How are these experiences gendered? I think is still an area I'm working on, and I think this would have to be part of a larger project, and I really have to maybe do it over a longer period of time, right? Because I think there's the practical aspects of trying to do this research. Remember back 6 months ago, everything was shut down, right? Or people were partially open. So there is sort of a very sort of practical and operational element in terms of even doing this work, right? Within a COVID framing. But I think I also need to be a bit smarter in terms of how to get the data and to also get more of those very specific quotes that you mentioned. And particularly in terms of gendered quotes, Howell, the Senegalese community is a very conservative Sunni Muslim community. So I, as a man, it would not be kosher for me to go directly and interview a woman. So I would have to think about, maybe getting a research assistant that was female and Muslim, to ask some of those questions. It's just a very practical thing that I need to think about and I need to navigate. So this was part of, obviously my shortcomings in terms of getting the data. It's something I need to think about and also work about getting, getting Muslim women's experiences, because it would be very insulting and would be very counterproductive to the work I'm doing if I tried to do that myself, to try and interview Muslim women directly. So thank you for highlighting that. In terms of attorneys and their experiences and how they navigate the COVID experience, from my work with the Senegalese community, it's purely around administrative and immigration. It's just unfortunate. And I think this is an area that really needs to be developed in terms of coalition building and in terms of integrating attorneys and Muslim attorneys in particular to try and also provide more effective information around COVID and around some of the legal challenges that that some of these immigrants experience within a COVID environment. So to answer your question, absolutely no, there's just no effective interaction in terms of the lawyering of the interactions between the legal community and this Senegalese community and COVID. A lot of the legal help they get is purely around fixing immigration paperwork and so on. I really like your comments on the trade and culture diaspora, and I think they're co-constitutive and intersubjective, right? So it's difficult to pass one from the other because the business is the culture and the culture is also in its own way the business, right? So if you think, for example, about the Murid Brotherhood, which is, essentially framed around the imams, who would come, for example, from Senegal, they'd visit, if they were visiting Harlem, then this community would donate tithes towards the mosque and towards this imam. And then the imam would go to London and a similar sort of way, and then to Paris, and then to Hong Kong. And then eventually he might go back to Dakar, and all these alms that he's collected would then go towards, say, an orphanage, right? Or to support a school. So it's a lot about the trade diaspora, but it's also a lot about the culture and how those two interrelate. So they're very closely tied. Also in terms of, when you think about access to credit, right, and financialization of this immigrant community, a lot of these networks are created and become created and realities to provide for the financial infrastructure that these marginalized communities wouldn't have otherwise. So they don't have credit, they might not necessarily be able to get loans from a traditional bank. So if Howell's my imam, I can actually go to Howell and request a loan or get credit purely on trust and faith and co-cultural precepts, right? Our shared sanguinity, but also our shared Islamic faith, right? So that's also another area that I need to look into. I guess, we don't have time for me to address, all the points you mentioned. I'd be glad to give, get more, or give you more of my thoughts on that, right? You want to be respectful of time and give everyone else a chance to share. But I do take your point around getting more quotes, more direct quotes about these lived experiences, and tweaking out some of the the nuances within the communities. But to answer one last element that you raised, right? Do these tensions, say, between host communities, the African American experience, and African immigrants, does that create tension and discord? Absolutely, yes, because they're self-isolated, they're Muslim, and they're immigrants, right? And obviously within the African American community, there's racial antagonisms in terms of how do Africans perceive African Americans and how do African Americans perceive Africans. But I also think that creates a lot of room for networks to be built, particularly in light of our last presentation on CRT and Sarah's presentation around these different coalitions, right? So say evangelicals and Catholics, hey, who'd have thought they'd work together, right? But thinking about how immigrants and native-born populations that have been here since the 1600s, right? How can these narratives and spaces for co-creation, not only of value, of entrepreneurship within some of these communities of color, but around sort of a deeper narrative of creating trust at the local level. You mentioned distrust in government. So I'd be thinking, how do we actually deal with it more from a council member framework, even before you start thinking about Washington? So with respect to everyone else, let me stop there and give others a chance to also share. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, David. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd like to, your education point was really interesting. It's a perspective that I hadn't considered a lot of. And actually, as Brian was presenting, I was thinking about it in terms of, getting excited, because I think there's a lot of directions you can go with education with, especially Christian communities, particularly among evangelical communities where homeschooling rates are really high. So I think, your point to look at education was well taken, and I look forward to working with it a little bit more, because I think Brian's discussion of the focus on parental control over education is really interesting, because this has really deep theological ties to family structure and the way that particularly conservative Christian groups feel like families should biblically be structured. And so I've just been sitting here thinking about like where I could go with that. So I really appreciate that. And I also really appreciate the way that you kind of like neatly laid out a lot of the directions that I'm going with my dissertation. I would like to work a lot more with elite cues. I don't have yet the data to work on whether or what comes first. Is it elite priming, or is it from congregants that are like encouraging elites to move in a specific direction? And I'd really like to work with that trend, because I think you're right, and the Catholic and evangelical union is demonstrative of this, that there has been an effort to actively construct this political coalition over the past 50 years. And so I'm really excited to move towards that in the larger project. And I kind of view this project as a setup for that by establishing that there are patterns that need to be better understood, that there are racial and religious elements to these things. And I'm very excited to move forward. So I appreciate that you picked up on that and also are looking for more there, because I am too. And your last question about like, what does this mean for our collective, democratic project, I also really appreciate, because I don't want to end on a sour note, but I don't think it leaves us anywhere good. But I'm also interested in examining, this isn't the first time that a religious movement has had significant political ramifications across US history. And so I'm also hoping to move in a direction, maybe doing some APD work, examining how those religious movements affected party alignments. And it certainly isn't the first religious movement in the United States either to say that, predestination is a really high priority, and therefore everything that we do on earth doesn't matter. And where does that leave us? So I am excited to look at some of the historical evidence for that as well.
Great, good luck. There's a lot there. I think there's a lot there for sure. Brian.
Okay, first of all, I want to mention that when Sarah was talking about family structure, that a lot of what I was doing was based on what I know about Reconstruction Christianity and its the idea of the patriarchal family along with Mosaic law. But going back to, and also I do have the question I put in the chat, are Catholics and evangelicals both equally anti-abortion? Because that's, one solid issue that you can see for getting support for Republicans, especially as regards judicial appointments. But back to my paper, when you said how is hegemony used, hegemony is used as a hegemonic struggle. You're right that the class categories are sort of cartoonish. The Gramsci part was actually put on at the end, as in, I had written, that was a section that was added nearly like in the last week. But I've written 14 different articles or conference papers on Gramsci at one point. Yes, obviously the class structure is much more complex. But since I was going to see Van Woodward, where in the South in the 1800s, it isn't that much more complex. It's pretty simple. You got a leading and Southern aristocracy that manages to co-opt white people, and that's sort of a model that you can make it more complicated for modern times. I would like to. You said you're sending it's your notes. If you have instances of the dying democracy literature, that would be great. Thanks for pointing to the three elements of that I had to ask about. You had to remind me of what I said, but putting in. Now this question of you came up at the end. Am I accepting that CRT is not Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and Richard Delgado, but is instead this generic concept? I'm accepting that is the way that it's being used on the right, and that ship has sailed. You're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. They're very successful at doing it, so that you're not going to win these arguments. CRT is not taught in the schools, especially if you have something like the anti-bias training, which I showed the slide of in the Bronx. It was not a school class. It was a class it was supposed to be an anti-bias training for white administrators and teachers. I did not attend. But there are a couple of lawsuits in New York right now for what was sometimes referred to as reverse discrimination in the Bronx. The same district superintendent who, I don't know the exact, who signed off on what, but under the same district and superintendent, you had that. And you have two people who were administrators and claimed that they wanted to get rid of them because they didn't go along with the the anti-bias training, including there was one instance in which one woman claimed, I refused to give the Wakanda salute at the end of the session. And they said, well, you know, you're not a team player in this. So what Rufo was very successful in doing was to find those sort of like glaring instances and then put them in this thing. And I think that, you know, my old philosophy professor used to tell me there were 3 umpires, and one umpire said, I call them as I see them. And the other said, I call them as they are. And the third said, until I call them, they ain't. They ain't balls and strikes then. And in the same way, once, you know, you have a discourse in which a significant, you know, basically this is now a litmus test, how you use CRT. And, you know, as I say in certain places, like Lindsay, who I don't like very much, but he has some arguments, said, look, if CRT is successful as an academic discourse, it's going to influence people. It's going to somehow find its way into the classroom. You know, and, you know, but the real key to this was in grouping all these things together. And they're especially against the 1619 project, and there are reasons to do that. I mean, I have a long bit on the 1619 project, which I like the narrative, but some of the specifics I could do without. And by having those emblems, anti-bias training, 1619 project, and then spreading it to the, you know, LGBTQ, I always get the letters mixed up, LGBTQ community, you know, it is creating the polarization or reinforcing the polarization and building on that polarization as a wedge issue. So all these contexts are interacting, you know, and that's why, you know, this idea of using different contexts is a new way of putting it. That, you know, I'm glad I had the chance to do this, but, you know, I'm going to have to do a lot of stuff to clean it up. My anti-CRT thing, my CRTA thing, actually, if you notice, it goes back to a paper I wrote in 1993 on, you know, consciousness, you know, mass political consciousness for people under racial oppression. It was comparing Guatemala and South Africa at the time. So it's sort of something that maybe I should extract from this, but I put it in for now because I was just putting, this was throwing things at the wall and see what sticks. I hope, you know. But the last thing, I just want to ask you said it's dialectical. I guess I just responded to that, you know, but what do you, could you expand on that?
I don't want to take up too much of our time, so we can talk about it. It seems like from the paper you're arguing that CRTA emerges in response to the backlash of CRT, and so
no, that's not what I meant at all.
Okay.
CRTA, but it emerges as the backlash to racial trauma as experienced by individuals, and so that, you know, you have these discourses on the Black body, white gaze, white fragility, white privilege, etc., and they all have common. I mean, Judith Herman writes on trauma, and Frantz Fanon, you know, a similar ideas is that, you know, there's this idea of consciousness that's suppressed, and CRTA is a response to a therapeutic surfacing of those traumas. So it's a little bit different. It's not a reaction to CRT or the anti-CRT movement that predates it, but I've labeled it as that. You know, I've put these different things together, and, you know, I don't know how many people are going to like the label.
Well, we will find out when the book comes out. So good luck with that. I wish you all the best of luck with these projects, and thank you for spending your Saturday with us.
Thank you. Enjoy
for your
Westchester.
comments.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.